Welcome everyone to the Culture and Community Circle workshop on Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and Workers' Rights Today, presented by Karla Gutierrez. Please join us for a presentation and discussion on the organizing and activism of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and the continued importance of protecting workers' rights today. Thank you.
Buenos dias, good morning. We're gonna start this presentation that is about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and how their struggle is still relevant in our present time. The presentation will be in two parts. The first part is a pre-recorded presentation by Araceli Centenino, history professor here at Cuyamaca College, but she couldn't be with us today, so she sent her video. She will talk about the contributions and legacy of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. As you watch her presentation, think about similarities with our present society. Are there any struggles that we are still fighting currently? And are different civil rights movements interconnected in the present? Okay, so I'm gonna put the video right now. I had some problems embedding the videos here, so I'm gonna be changing screens. Hold on. Okay, so. And I'm gonna so I'm gonna start the video, and this is a presentation about them, and I'm gonna be presenting about the current times. Okay.
Hello, my name is Araceli Centenino. I'm an instructor of history at Cuyamaca College. I teach U.S. history and Chicanx history. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the history of Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, the United Farm Worker Movement, and the legacy it has left for all of us. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get right into it. All right, so the title for today's lecture is Huelga. And huelga in Spanish means strike. If you don't know, the woman in this image here is Dolores Huerta, one of the figures I'm going to be talking to you about today, and she's holding up a sign that says huelga. So just to give you a little bit of context about where Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez get their political activism start, and this longer history of Mexican-American civil rights, I want to start a conversation with the Community Service Organization, also known as the CSO. The CSO was a very active civil rights organization in Mexican-American communities. It was founded in 1947 by Fred Ross and Edward Roybal in Los Angeles, and from there spread out. They fought for many things, but just like the name implies, community service organization, they were a community-based advocacy grassroots movement. They fought for things like better schools. They fought against police brutality. They fought for basic community improvement projects like paving roads and sidewalks. And most importantly, they really focused on increasing voter turnout and voter participation. So they did things like voter registration drives, and they did things like citizenship classes for immigrants in the community, immunization campaigns to provide vaccines for the community. So they had a very broad and varied interest in projects that they were doing. Now, they're often conflated with the Mexican-American civil rights movement, as they should be, because they primarily worked in Mexican-American neighborhoods like East Los Angeles. But the CSO was a deeply interracial organization. One of the founding members, Fred Ross, he's not Mexican-American. And many of the members of the CSO were African-American, Asian-American, Jewish-American, as well as Mexican-American. So it's important to acknowledge that, because oftentimes when we learn about civil rights organizations or civil rights movements, right, we learn about them in isolation from other groups. For example, we learn about the African-American civil rights movement, the Mexican-American civil rights movement, the Asian-American civil rights movement, the Native American movement, right? And we treat these movements as separate, but in reality, as I hope to show you through this presentation, and as I hope you will continue to learn, that civil rights has always been an interconnected struggle, right? And even though a lot of these movements might seem separate from each other, they're always in communication with one another. They're sharing support, they're sharing networks and resources, right? So there's a lot of intergroup alliance and solidarity and cooperation happening at the heart of all of these movements. And so that's an important thing to stress, because we're going to return to this point later on in the lecture. So the CSO is really where Cesar Chavez gets his organizing start, right? And by organizing, I mean community organizing, political activism, right? And he learns how to do that in the CSO. So in 1952, Cesar Chavez is working as a farm worker. He had been born and raised around farm worker communities his whole life, so this was nothing new to him. And you know, in the 1940s, when he was a teen, he was a zoot suiter, joined the Navy, and when he returned from deployment, he continued working as a farm worker, saw firsthand the poverty and hardship that farm workers faced, and it was a cause that was really near and dear to his heart. And when he meets Fred Ross in 1952, he sees through the CSO an opportunity to get more active in politics and to maybe make a change. So he joins the organization and really quickly rises through the ranks into a leadership position in the CSO. But ultimately, he and the CSO end up parting ways, mainly because Chavez's main goal was to organize farm workers into a union, and that wasn't necessarily a priority for the community service organization, which had such a broad and varied agenda. So it's on that basis that they part ways. But before that happens, in Stockton, California, Dolores Huerta is working as a school teacher. And many of the children that she is working with come from farm worker families. And she sees firsthand the poverty and hardship that farm worker families deal with on a day-to-day basis. And she sees how that impacts the ability of school children to be successful in school. And she becomes passionate about doing something more. She feels like she can't really make the changes she wants to make by working as a school teacher. So she decides that she's going to join the CSO in 1955 and leave her job as a school teacher. Now, this was a very bold decision for Dolores Huerta to make. In 1955, she was a divorced woman, a single mom, raising 7 children, and she's leaving behind a steady job that, you know, might have brought her some type of stability and to her and to her family. And she leaves that all behind to really make a difference, right? That's how committed she is. And she said that when she told people that she was going to leave her job and be a full-time community organizer, that they thought she was crazy, right? She said, they all looked at me like I was bananas. And it was really quite bold and shows the extent of her passion for this. So it's in the CSO that Huerta and Chavez meet each other, and they really find commonality in their care and concern for farm workers. And they decide that they're going to set out to organize farm workers into a union. Now, this is a really ambitious goal because it's been something that has been a long-standing struggle and fight for much of the 20th century, right? This predates Cesar Chavez and Huerta by many decades. Like in the 1910s and 1920s, many farm workers and agricultural workers would go on strike to demand better working conditions and better pay. The strikes were often put down violently by law enforcement and broken. And in the 1930s, which is a heyday for unionizing and the creation of new unions, farm workers were left out of that unionizing push. Things like the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed during the New Deal under FDR's presidency, cut out agricultural workers and domestic workers from New Deal protections, specifically the right to unionize or collectively bargain. So this shows you how long-standing this project of unionizing farm workers is and how hard of a road it has been. So when Chavez and Huerta set out to do this, they have the weight of that history on their shoulders, and they decide that they're going to do it anyway. So another important inspiring element in all of this is the larger civil rights movement that's happening, specifically the work of Martin Luther King Jr. He is advocating things like nonviolent direct action, and that is a direct inspiration to Cesar Chavez, who decides that he's going to use the principles of nonviolence in the strikes and boycotts that he plans to make. So in September of 1965, this is when things start happening. 5,000 grape workers walk out from over 30 different farms. They just up and leave, walk out on the job, and they're protesting things from poor working conditions, low wages, discrimination from employers, lack of toilets and facilities on the job, and so many other things. The list is virtually endless, right? And by December, Cesar Chavez and other activists who have been watching this grape boycott, this is their opportunity, and they start calling for a statewide grape boycott. Now, the strike continues into the following year, and by the end of the summer, August 1966, the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee is born. Cesar Chavez is the director. Larry Itliong, Filipino-American man, is the assistant director, and Dolores Huerta is the union's negotiator. So Larry Itliong, it's important to spend some time there. He's Filipino-American, and so his presence on this organizing committee as part of the leadership is really important and symbolic because, you know, oftentimes we associate the UFW and Cesar Chavez's work as being about Mexican Americans and Mexican Americans being farm workers. But the farm worker population is more than just Mexican American, and a good chunk of the farm worker population is Filipino and Filipino American. So the presence of Larry Itliong is really important not only for the organizing efforts, but also shows you that interconnectedness of struggles that I mentioned earlier, right? These movements have always been interracial, and they depend on interracial alliance and solidarity in order to survive and to be successful. So Larry Itliong is not there by mistake or coincidence, right? It's a very important choice. On top of that, let's talk about Dolores Huerta. She is a woman in power, in leadership, in a leadership position, which is very unique and rare for this time period. And not only is she a woman, she's a woman of color, which is, even more rare to have someone like her in a leadership position. And not just any leadership position, she's the union's main negotiator. So her job is to go to all of these powerful and rich grape growers and get them to sit down to the bargaining table and negotiate a contract. And they do this work for the next 5 years. That's how long the grape strike lasted. Now, Chavez, his main concern is to grow public support for this cause. So he's going to churches. He is a Catholic man, so he's appealing to the Christian conscience of churches and trying to get their support for the farm worker cause. He's also going to universities to talk to students. And that's really important because this being the late 60s, the student movement all over the country is in full swing. Many students are involved in activist causes. And in California, the Chicano student movement is also on the rise. And so he finds natural allies there with the growing Chicano student movement, who become some of the most vocal and important supporters of the United Farm Worker movement. And so it's with that support that Chavez begins pressuring local and national leaders to support the cause and to pass collective bargaining legislation. So he's pressuring Edwin Brown, who's the governor of California, and he's pressuring President Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, to expand the National Labor Relations Act to include farm workers in the right to unionize. And not only are they drawing support and membership from universities and churches, they're also drawing support from the community level, right? So union volunteers are going door to door in neighborhoods, trying to get people to support the farm worker union, to tell them that they shouldn't buy grapes, right? They're doing flyering in neighborhoods, radio announcements in Spanish and English. They're standing outside of supermarkets, telling shoppers not to buy grapes. They're conducting public rallies, organizing public rallies and public speaking events. So they're doing a lot to get the message out. And actually, before I continue on, another important point to make is that it's not, oftentimes when we think about activism in the 60s, we always think about adults. Adults, organizing and leading protests. But the farm worker movement is actually really interesting because it was a whole family affair. And as this image shows us, it wasn't just adults going door to door and holding rallies and picketing, right? It was also children and families to show that the farm worker cause was a family movement, right? It wasn't just about the farm workers themselves, but it was also about their families and getting justice, economic justice for their families. So while all of this is happening, Chavez decides that he needs to do something else, something more bold to get statewide and national attention. So he organizes a march from Delano to Sacramento on March 17th, 1966. And marchers walk 340 miles in 25 days. And when they finally get to Sacramento, they go onto the steps of the state capitol, and Chavez, facing thousands of reporters and television cameras and supporters, right, a huge crowd, he delivers a speech, and he declares that the Great Boycott must move beyond California. It needs to be a nationwide boycott. And despite all of this ruckus, all of this commotion, all of this national attention that Chavez is garnering, grape growers are still refusing to come to the bargaining table and negotiate a contract with Dolores Huerta. And the picket line is starting to become a much more violent place. Strikers and law enforcement are having really violent confrontations. And Chavez decides that he needs to do something to diffuse the tension, reduce the violence, right? And at the same time, gain more public attention for the farm worker cause. So he announces he's going to do a 25-day fast. And this tactic is ultimately successful because he earns the recognition and support from Senator Robert Kennedy, who is President John F. Kennedy's brother, who at this point has been assassinated, but Bobby Kennedy is a growing supporter of civil rights. And he is very interested in Chavez's movement. And Bobby Kennedy is also has his eye on the presidential race, is considering running as the Democratic nominee. And so the fact that Chavez is able to gain the support of someone who is, you know, so well known in Washington and so well connected, such as a Kennedy, is really important for the farm worker cause. Kennedy is also Catholic, so there's that added connection there, and he decides that he's going to go to Delano to take communion with Chavez when Chavez decides to end his fast. In addition to the support from Kennedy, Chavez also earned support from Martin Luther King Jr. Just 1 month before he's assassinated. So it's these two very important national figures, one being Kennedy, representative of the political establishment in Washington, the Democratic Party, and support from one of the main leaders of the African-American civil rights movement, gives Chavez the confidence he needs to keep going. So riding that wave of support, Chavez organizes another march, this time from Coachella to the Imperial Valley, and then to the border in 1969. And all of this wave of support that Chavez gets is finally enough to convince, in 1970, two of the nation's largest grape growers to finally come to the negotiating table and settle on a contract with Dolores Huerta. And as a result of that effort, 2/3 of California grapes would now be grown under contract with 50,000 members of the United Farm Workers Union. So a truly historic and unprecedented thing has happened. And not only that, this also gives extra confidence and encouragement to a growing Chicano student movement. This is truly a victory for so many people, right? It's a victory for civil rights. It's a victory for labor, and shows us that when we take care of the most vulnerable of people, in this case, you know, farm workers, we all win. Now, I want to spend a little time here on Dolores because in many ways, her struggle is quite different than, someone like Cesar Chavez or even Larry Itlion. She is a woman in a leadership role, which meant that she had very unique challenges. She was shamed in the movement, from people, from her own supporters, or not supporters, but from people, who she, was organizing with. She was shamed for being a single mother, for having children out of wedlock. She was also shamed for raising 11 children on her own while being a full-time activist, right? That, shamed her for wanting to be a full-time activist instead of raising her kids. And she felt that guilt for a long time, but she relied on her networks of friends and family members and other women involved in the movement to help her with childcare. But oftentimes she also brought her kids with her, right? She brought her kids with her to rallies and speaking engagements. As we can see in this image right here, she's got her kids with her. And she also brought them to the negotiating table, right? She remembers vividly this one moment where she was still nursing one of her children, and she was at the negotiating table with one of the grape growers, and she would have to pause negotiations so that she could go nurse her child, right? So it wasn't, it wasn't always on the grower's schedule, it was on the child's schedule. And it was by bringing in that sense of motherhood, that identity of motherhood into her negotiations for the union, that she was able to really hammer home that this, worker contract wasn't just for the rights of workers, it was for their family, right? It was for the benefit of children. And bringing that added a new level of significance to what she was doing and to the importance of the farm worker cause. And then in addition to that, she also faced sexism within the movement itself. She talks about how at her organizing committee meetings, men like Cesar Chavez and other men involved in the movement would say sexist comments all the time, like not even think about it, right? And she would just keep a tally in her notebook of every sexist remark that was uttered in those meetings. And then at the end, she would say, you all said this many sexist comments in this meeting. And by consistently calling them out, she got them to be more mindful of the things that they said and to be more aware of their own sexism. So in many ways, she was fighting several struggles, not just the struggle for civil rights and not just the struggle for farm workers, right? And in many ways, these struggles interconnected and bled into each other. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the legacies of Cesar Chavez and the legacies of Dolores Huerta. So Cesar Chavez died in 1993 in Arizona, not far from where he was born. And after he died, he was posthumously awarded a Medal of Freedom. And that means he was awarded this medal after his death in 1994 by the Bill Clinton administration. It was the highest civilian award that a person could receive. He left behind a really important legacy of advocating for the poor and fighting for the dignity of farm workers. And later on in his life, before he died, he branched out to many different causes, not just farm workers, but labor activism in general, Mexican American rights, and also environmentalism, right? He was a vocal opponent to pesticide use. But it's also important to acknowledge that for all the wonderful things of his legacy, he also has some really important drawbacks. The main one being his complicated stance on immigration. Early on in his career, he was an opponent of undocumented workers. he would criticize them because oftentimes growers would call in undocumented workers as strike breakers. So he saw them as being, an adversary of sorts. He also blamed them for driving down farm worker wages because of their willingness to work for lower wages, and that, that willingness to work for lower wages hurt the farm worker movement in general. And there are accounts of Cesar Chavez, encouraging the United Farm Workers members to go down to the border and form what's called a wet line, which was to block essentially undocumented immigrants from entering the country. There are also reports of him calling immigration authorities on undocumented workers. So this is a hard reality for a lot of Mexicans and Mexican Americans to grapple with, because we often see him as this champion for Mexican causes and Mexican rights, and it's hard to see him as someone who was so against undocumented people. But later on in his life, he came around on the issue and went from being, an opponent to undocumented immigration to a supporter of amnesty. So he turned things around. But, this often happens when we make heroes out of human beings, right? Everyone has flaws and everyone has contradictions. And when we make heroes out of ordinary human beings who do heroic things, it makes it really hard to see them in an honest light. But despite all of his flaws, I think the really important lesson here is that Cesar Chavez shows us that, we are all capable of change, and that we should all reflect on, all aspects of ourselves, flaws and all, and work to change those things. So despite, some of these drawbacks, it doesn't take away from the important things that he taught us. And it doesn't take away from his efforts to change his problematic stance later in life. And then, of course, there's Dolores Huerta, who is, continues to be active in politics to this day. The woman has boundless energy. She continues to work to elect Latinos to political office. She fights for women's issues. And in 2012, she finally earned some recognition from the president for her work. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. And she continues to be an example for all of us on how to defy the odds, no matter how stacked the cards may be against us, to never stop fighting for what we believe in, to never stop fighting against injustice. And that when we work, in solidarity with other people, when we work for the rights of those who are most vulnerable in society, we all win. So that is all I have for you today. I encourage you to continue to research and read up on Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and the fight for a farm worker union and its context in the greater story of the civil rights movement in the United States. And I hope to see you all in my classes one day.
Okay, let's continue with the the questions I previously asked you. Can you relate any of the movements referred to in the video with the social justice movements of the present? Anyone? Anything you heard about and that you can say, oh, this is still happening? No? Okay. Well, let me show you my next slide. Let's see if you can think of something now. Anyone? No? Okay. So lately in the news, we have seen several civil rights movements emerging from silence, I guess, especially with the pandemic situation that we're living right now. And this shows us that many struggles from the past are still relevant in our present, such as police brutality, voter suppression and participation, vaccination campaigns. Right now, that's a big topic, right? African American movements, or Black Lives Matter, as we call it today, anti-Asian American and Pacific Islanders hate movements, the Me Too movement for women victims of sexual assaults, and many others. And all these were mentioned in Araceli's presentation. And just like Chavez and Huerta and the CSO did, they get together in coalitions because cooperation is necessary in successful advocacy for policies that improve the lives of the disadvantaged. Okay. So in the last year, we have seen many people from different groups coming together to protest. That was my last screen. We have seen people coming together to protest against social injustice and work conditions, especially during the era of COVID-19. Okay, essential workers from different areas have complained about the lack of personal protective equipment and guidelines for the safe work environment. Okay, so what is the United Farm Workers Union currently doing for farm workers? On March 17th of last year, the United Farm Workers sent an open letter to all agricultural employers and organizations urging them to take proactive steps to ensure the safety of farm workers, protect buyers, and safeguard our consumers. Those steps include extending state-required sick pay to 40 hours or more, removing caps on accruing sick pay, ending the 90-day wait period many employers require before workers can claim sick time, and and ceasing to ask them for letters from doctors when field laborers were sick. However, farm workers have reported that there are not enough wash bins on the farms, having to bring their own toilet paper, not having masks available for them to use during their work hours, but they do not make requests to their employers because they are afraid of retaliation. Some farm workers have been told to keep working even though they were exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19. Some farms sell masks to farm workers for prices as high as $8, but farm workers cannot afford them considering that they earn $13 per hour. So $8 to get a mask is almost an hour of work. The situation of farm workers is complicated because more than 50% of them are undocumented and they don't benefit from the programs or stimulus available for essential workers. And I'm gonna show you a video where a farm worker and a farm owner are talking about this situation, so you can see what they have to say. This is actually a farm that it's following the recommendations of the United Farm Workers. So the other ones won't speak, but this one is someone who has improved the situation of farm workers, okay? But not all of them are gonna be like that.
And I think, in addition, there isn't really a plan of how on the ground they are going to change the practices to ensure that social distancing. So I think that that's very much a concern.
Es un video porque no vemos su pantalla.
Y Karla, no se ve nada, nomás se ven los nombres, no estás sharing screen para ver el video. Te estamos viendo a ti.
Sí, gracias. Lo voy a poner de nuevo. I'm gonna put it again. I think there was some problem because the presentation was like stopped for a second. Okay, I'll share again. Hold on. Am I sharing now? Yes, right?
Yes.
It's visual. Karla, you just need to make the video larger because we could see your presentation as well as the video now.
So what's happening now?
Otra vez, Karla, no se ve nada, como que se congela la imagen tuya y se congela el video.
Okay, hold on.
It did the same thing, Karla.
Yeah, you stop recording because it's been, I don't know if you noticed that the